Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started in just another minute or so. So if everyone can start moving in and taking their seats. Wow, I think that was the quietest a room has ever gotten first thing in the morning. I feel so powerful. We're going to give it just another minute for folks to come in and take their seats, and we'll get started. Forgot to drop off my coffee, so apologies. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Hopkins. I'm the director for the Rare Orphan and Pediatric program here at CPATH, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to day one of the second annual Global Impact Conference hosted by Critical Path Institute. So we are really excited to have you here with us today. We have 3 days of really packed, exciting agenda that we look forward to sharing with you and engaging with you over the next couple days. And as we kick off, we wanted to start with sharing a video about the history of CPATH, where we've come from, where we are going in the future. Many of you in this room have been with us, if not from the beginning, certainly for many of the years represented. And for those of you who are maybe newer to CPATH, we look forward to sharing with you some of our history, as well as building new history with you over the coming years with exciting new collaborations. So welcome again, and please enjoy this video with the history of CPATH. Thank you.
It all started with just 6 employees and one mission: to streamline the drug development process, making it faster and more cost-efficient. 20 years later, Critical Path Institute, known as CPATH, continues its vital work. Over the past 2 decades, CPATH has forged over 400 strategic partnerships, engaged 1,600 science and data contributors, secured more than $120 million in FDA funding since 2013, and developed solutions that have transformed challenging therapeutic areas like tuberculosis, Alzheimer's, and polycystic kidney disease. It's been 20 years of collaboration, impact, inspiration, and innovation. Advancing drug development, improving lives together. Here's to 20 years of CPATH and to countless breakthroughs yet to come.
Thank you. Okay, so just a couple housekeeping things that we want to go over before I turn it over to our esteemed CEO, Klaus Romero. So first of all, we will have a couple breaks throughout the day. So we have a morning break, a lunchtime where we have some breakout sessions that we invite you to participate in, and then an afternoon break. So we will have refreshments during the break right out here in the hallway, as well as lunch. This event is being recorded, and we'll make some of the videos available on our website. So please, if you can be mindful, there is a camera right here in the center of the room. So when you're taking your seats here in the middle, if you can just please be mindful of the camera. Restrooms are right out to the left where you see the stairs and the elevator. If you go past the elevator, there's the restrooms there. And then if we can ask if you can please silence all mobile devices and cell phones for this morning. And with that, I would like to welcome up our CEO, Dr. Klaus Romero. Thank you.
Nicely done. All right. Thank you, Laura, and thanks everyone for joining us today. You saw the video, 20 years of a journey of impact and transforming a lot of paradigms in drug development, but we still have many paradigms to transform. because our work is never done. There will always be unmet needs. There will always be additional opportunities to realize the promise that came out of the FDA's Critical Path Initiative in 2004, where the FDA, in a very visionary document, told the world, hey, everybody, we have the mission to regulate the products. Industry has the mission to develop the products. Who has the mission to make the process efficient? It can be just us. It can be individual companies on their own. So why don't we set up public-private partnerships to make this happen? And that's exactly what we're up to doing, what we've been up to for the past 20 years, and certainly what we want to make sure that we continue doing. But it's all about this, transforming data into actionable knowledge that can be used to set up new paradigms for drug development. We have the ability to take data from many different sources, not just the clinical trials that our pharma partners contribute to us. Those data are really, really precious, but also the data that come from our academic collaborators, the data that come from the university observational studies, also the data that our patient advocates have contributed, those registries that capture the living experience very uniquely across a journey of time. Those are the kinds of data that we have the ability to integrate. And you can imagine that those data are not just literally, but figuratively speaking many different languages. And that's the core competency that we have to make sure that we can make all those data end up speaking the same language and make those data portable and ergonomic for some pretty impactful analytics, so that we can then develop those drug development tools that we are known for, those new clinical outcome assessment tools, the ones that are used by clinicians, the ones that the trial participants themselves can fill out with their experiences, the biomarkers and those additional insights that you can gain from the underlying pathophysiology of the diseases, and the quantitative solutions that have the ability to look at the data longitudinally over time to then be able to put those solutions in front of our regulatory colleagues for review, making those tools publicly available for everyone to adopt, and have that become an impact to transform drug development and make sure that we address the need of the people that actually are expecting and waiting for those treatments that are really going to improve their lives. So that is what you're going to hear throughout the entire 3 days. And I have the honor just to call out a person that was behind this whole transformation. That's Janet Woodcock, who's sitting at the front. Let's give her a hand. And she's clearly not done with us. You'll hear some of the things that we're up to behind the scenes to make the next transformation. Okay, so with that, we're going to transition into our first panel. So we're going to talk about removing barriers and realizing impact for disease modification, disease interception, and prevention, with a focus on starting with those people that stand to benefit the most, which are kids. So with that, I'll call up the panel to join me on stage. All right. So I'm going to start introducing the panel from the end, and I'll conclude with Julia. So Stefan, you've been a regulator with EMA and also a supporter and a collaborator with us at CPATH. Where do you see your strengths linking to the conversation that we're going to have?
Well, as a global regulator, and we got FDA colleagues around here as well, I think the importance is to think global here. If we start digging our own holes and working, even the hole may be a big hole as US or Europe, but we need to think globally because many of these diseases end up, even though there are a lot of children, they end up being rare diseases. And the therapies we increasingly see ends up being advanced therapies, personalized medicines, N-of-1 trials. And if we don't work on setting global standards in a collaborative manner, I think I strongly believe that many of those developments will not happen.
Excellent. Chris, you've been a supporter of us and a partner since day one. Now you're with Sanofi thinking about regulatory policy and modernization. Where do you see that moving?
So I was trying to work out, Klaus, when we first started working together, and then you have this really cool timeline outside. So 2009, you and I were working together. How do we get these data into the right format in a way that can be put together into this database and create what was basically the CAMD database? So I sometimes think we've come a long way since then, and we haven't made much progress since then, because I think the challenge that we have is about the data. The data is all over the place. It's all, like you say, all sorts of different formats. And I think increasingly challenges like data sovereignty and other issues around it are actually creating more obstacles to being able to share those data, not fewer. And there, I think, is where we need to do a lot of work. We need to work out how do we liberate the data? How do we put the data together to be able to leverage it to achieve the goals that you laid out in your introduction?
Excellent. Dionna, you definitely care about the pediatric angle, not just from a pediatric sense, but the impact that pediatric drug development has across the entire span of a lifetime of a human being. Where do you see the partnerships moving?
Yes, I'm excited to be here to talk about this topic because I do feel like for pediatrics, we have as a collective had to address complex issues from the beginning. And so because of that, we're used to thinking outside of the box. We're used to thinking about overcoming barriers and hurdles. And public-private partnerships, innovative approaches are things that we have to do by necessity. And I can't echo more Stefan's comments about global work, because I do feel like because pediatrics often has to be global by necessity, we do have to think together, we have to align, we have to understand where we disagree, and we have to figure out how do we make sure that we have a sustainable infrastructure to make sure that these trials and these programs can move forward effectively, efficiently, save costs, save time, and speed innovations to children who are waiting.
Excellent. And I saved the best for last. So Julia, you have been a force of nature in transforming things that just got thrown at you by life itself. So I'll let you introduce yourself, but also cue up a little treat that we have for everyone.
Thanks. Thank you for including my voice on this as well. Yeah, I mean, I am mom to Mila first and foremost, and I come with the experience, the lived experience, unfortunately, of living, having a daughter that was completely typical, healthy, outgoing, hiking, skiing, climbing, and then being told that she was going to die, lose all of her abilities and die, in the next few years when she was just 6 years old. And I'd like to tell a little bit more, but I think first, and I apologize for my cough, I would like to show a very short video of Mila. I think it's really important in meetings like this to start with, and I appreciate, Klaus, you including this video, this is why we're here. It's great to have an intellectual discussion about global, standardization and data sharing, but it's lived experiences like my own where you have a very typical child, and often cases, and told that that child's going to die. That's what the data supports, right? So let's start with, if it's okay, with just a 3-minute video of Mila.
Yeah, let's do that.
My sunshine, my only sunshine, you make me happy when skies are gray.
So our daughter's name is Mila Virginia Makovets. She was born on November 5th, 2010. When I think about Mila as an infant, I think about smiles and laughter and health. And
half an hour after she was born, she was strong enough to hold on to my finger, and I could almost pick her up off the bed.
when Mila was a toddler, she was a climber, she was a hiker, she was a runner.
How old are you, Mila? Here's our sugar high daughter. Slide, slide, slide. Woohoo!
Very physical, always loved to ride a strider,
Hey, Spud.
play in the snow, go sledding.
Coming.
We noticed that Mila was getting stuck on her words. She would say, "Mommy, mommy, I have to, mommy, I have to," and not be able to continue. And then suddenly around 3 years old, we started noticing that her feet were slightly unturned and she was walking strangely. And then at 4 years old, we noticed that she pulled books in close. And then around 5 years old, Mila's feet started moving really quickly in this strange pit-pattering way. And then she would fall back on her butt. And every time she stood up, she would fall back and stand up and fall back. You know, we took her around to different doctors who never could really kind of figure out what was going on with her. And then time passes, and then in just 1 month, everything can change. She could no longer see anything. What's brought her so much happiness is playing with her toys and or looking at her books and watching TV and playing with her brother. And suddenly it looked like she could no longer play with anything. It's so hard to see such a outgoing little girl not be able to play with other kids and not be able to play with toys and not be able to watch Elmo anymore.
I've seen that hundreds of times, and it always feels like I'm watching someone else's story. My life was completely normal, and just from one day to the next, I was told my daughter that was, as you saw, completely outgoing was going to die, and there was nothing I could do about it. And she was one of, 25 kids in the world that had Batten, Seal, 7, a rare form of an already rare disease. And, like you've heard many other parents do, I sort of dropped everything. My life as I knew it was sort of over at that minute. Everything that brought me joy didn't really matter anymore. It was just I needed to fight for my daughter. So I started a foundation. I started telling her story. I somehow raised millions of dollars, literally selling lemonade and cookies and putting scientists together, doctors together, and raced against time for a year for her, together with Dr. Timothy Yu, Boston Children's Hospital. And it just happened to be that she was missing a mutation. And upon finding that mutation, it opened up a potential treatment for her, which was an antisense oligonucleotide, or ASO. But the catch was that it was only for her, that no one else in the world had that specific mutation. And as you can imagine, many people said to Dr. Yu, like, that's crazy. How can you design a medicine for one person? Luckily, he said she's dying, and we're showing that we're restoring health to her cells in 3 different labs across the country. And luckily, the FDA was incredibly quick and approved this first ever in the world new medicine for one person. That's not what we set out to do, but that's what happened. And we moved to Boston, and a year from her being treated, not 10 years, but a year later, we moved in. Her 30 seizures a day stopped. She had a G-tube put in because she was rapidly going downhill and choking, and she was eating by mouth again. She was taking stronger steps up the stairs with me holding her from behind. She was laughing and smiling. All these things are relevant here because these are the things that are meaningful and measurable to a family. And they are things that since then, many other families who have followed in Mila's pathway have experienced many of the exact same benefits from individualized ASOs for different mutations for different diseases. So you can see the trends that are anecdotally being caught, but not necessarily right within a database. My daughter did incredibly well in the first year, but it wasn't in time for her. And it's still hard for me to talk about it because it seems impossible that my just super outgoing little girl that was the center of attention, only lived till she was 10 years old, and she was on her drug Milacin for 3 years. And I was faced with decisions that I just can't believe that millions of parents out there have to face like I do, about whether or not my daughter would want to live because she couldn't take a fly off of her nose and couldn't talk anymore, and she had lost her vision completely. The reason that I'm still here and the reason I appreciate Klaus working with us on this is that what my daughter showed is that while it wasn't in time for her, that there is a different way of treating disease, that whether we like it or not, we're in an era of individualized medicines. That's what my daughter showed was possible. We've more recently seen the amazing story of baby KJ and the first individualized CRISPR. Like, this is happening. And so what does that mean? It means that we're going to have to change the way we do things. And what I spend a lot of my time on right now is figuring that science isn't the limiting factor, is that the regulatory and the reimbursement are, and they require everyone working together to think about how to do this differently. This isn't a battle against FDA or EMA. This is a, how do we do this differently in this new paradigm? And how are we going to go from a few dozen drugs for massive numbers of people to the opposite of maybe thousands of medicines, each for small, it doesn't matter about one, like small numbers of patients, because that is what's going to happen. We have 10 to 14,000 small genetic diseases is what I'll call them. And within that, they're being subcategorized by mutation. So we have to change. And what does that mean? That means that we need to be able to have a way to collect the learnings in a standardized fashion around the world to be able to support a significant regulatory and reimbursement shift and help those that are developing, whether they're academics or companies, do it in a safer, faster, better way. Because there's a lot of kids out there that need treatments, and 30 kids in the last 7 years have followed Mila's path. That's it. But we know that millions are potentially amenable to not only ASOs, but base editing, prime editing, et cetera. So we have to shift this. So I'm really grateful we're having this discussion, and I'll stop there.
No, fantastic, Julia. Thank you. And this is exactly why we're here. It's about the ultimate benefit that our work is intended to provide to those in need. So I'll move to Dionna next, because we've had conversations about how this may seem like it's a rare and orphan disease question, but it really isn't, because you can take a non-rare disease, and once you start identifying all those sources of variability all the way down to some genetic factors, you end up with a very small population that has the very nuanced mechanisms underlying it. So can you comment on the agency's thinking about how to modernize the way we think about the evidence generation enterprise?
Sure. First of all, Julia, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for sharing Mila's story again. I'm always touched when I hear it. I have to say that I think we're at a unique time. I said this, I was at the International Neonatal Consortium meeting yesterday, and I think we're at a unique time in the scientific and research enterprise, in that we have tremendous capabilities that we didn't have before in terms of helping to shore up and understand and evaluate and critically evaluate evidence basis. So we are now in a place where we have lots of data across different aspects of product development. We've learned a lot of lessons, particularly for pediatrics and rare diseases. We do still have a long way to go. But what we found is that each case, each child, each person, each family that provides data into what we're trying to achieve in terms of understanding these molecules is not wasted and should not be wasted. And now we have technology in hand to be able to make sure that those data points aren't wasted, that those experiences, that those real lived experiences aren't wasted. And so I think Specifically as it comes to product development for pediatrics and rare diseases, when we're looking at the data and we're looking at the evidence generation, we're very fortunate to now be able to say we've learned a lot from non-clinical models. We have a lot coming online in terms of novel alternative methodologies we see happening. We have a lot of modeling and simulation and quantitative tools. And I know all of this is sort of technical aspects, but those things are now colliding to the point where we're able to partner them along with the real world data and the everyday evidence that's being generated by the patients that are living out these diseases and experiencing intervening therapies. And so I think we're looking at the totality of evidence, and we are starting to really continue that path and make sure that we're looking holistically at what we know at any given time point.
Fantastic. Now, Stefan, from the standpoint of the EMA's vision for the integration and use of data, can you comment on the dialogue we've had about how these partnerships support the vision of your agency towards that goal?
I think we first of all, many thanks for sharing this Mila story here. I think it's a good set out for this discussion, and it shows the complexity of this area, because fundamentally we're talking about one patient and one therapy, and yet again maybe a group of patients where there may be minor tweaks and then a therapy. And I completely agree with you. As regulators, we need to think differently. We're not talking about populations and median and standard deviations and p-values. We're going to have another way of generating the supportive evidence, and we're going to think even more about the totality of evidence and also bringing in real-world data. And I think we are very keen on real-world evidence and real-world data, but I think still we have a challenge that the data we can get our hands on are not good enough. They are not detailed enough. We have in Europe, you have the same in US, you got your insurance companies, we got the healthcare systems that collect a lot of data, which are ordinary, medical file data, and they don't contain what we're looking for here. They don't contain to the level of detail that you were describing for Mila, her performance, what meant something for her, what meant something for you as a family. They are not in the medical records. So the real world evidence, yes, it's nice, but we need to step up the level of details that we can get into these kind of data. And we as regulators need to have a discussion among ourselves and with the patient and caretakers, what is relevant, and that could be something for CPAS to engage together. What do we mean by meaningful disease modification? What is meaningful, not for us as regulators, but because we can easily agree that a certain change in a certain scale is okay for us, but does it mean something for the patient? And even moving outside the remit of FDA and EMA to the payers, we're going to be able to generate data that the insurance companies or healthcare system are willing to pay for. And they will also be looking at the size and the benefits and so forth. So I think we have a lot of work to do in discussing what is meaningful disease modification. How do we get our hands on those data? Because we need to move out. We cannot do clinical trials in the old-fashioned sense here. We can collect clinical data, but we also need to rely on data that is being captured by healthcare system. And those data are currently not granular enough to make good regulatory decisions.
Now, thank you, Stefan. That's a great setup to dive deeper into what Chris was mentioning, but also Julia's input, because you identified, Chris, some of the things that at first glance may seem like insurmountable barriers to data sharing and data integration. With the, of course, well-intended mindset of protecting privacy and providing security for data that belong to human beings. But what we've seen as a common denominator message, this is why Julia's angle is important here, that every single time we've had a conversation about data sharing from the standpoint of the people that actually contributed the data and contributed their time to research, they want their data to have maximum utility, maximum impact. How have you seen from an industry standpoint that being a leverage point for further data integration? And then Julia, if you can deepen that interest that the patient groups have for data sharing. So Chris.
I mean, you're right, Klaus, because it's almost like completely countervailing forces. Exactly what you say, that, people who participate in clinical trials and clinical research and want their data to be used, and yet in industry particularly, we're working a lot with regulators who say, no, we have to protect data, we have GDPR, you have to, there are so many obstacles in the way of being able to use those data and really liberate the data and allow them to do what people who contributed want them to do, which is to add to our knowledge and add to the development of new cures. I think, one of the things we would love to see is a more realistic understanding of what are the benefits and what are the risks around really making the data available, how to move away from, I think, what is a genuine concern about privacy, like you say, but it can't be the only factor that drives how the data are made available. And I mean, with all due respect to all the people who are doing a lot of good work around, for example, EHDS, right? What we're seeing is almost an emergence of yet more control over us being able to access those data. I mean, if you're following what's happening with the HDS, and apologies if I speak out of turn here, but the access to the data are going to be controlled by health data access bodies that are country by country. So now you have another layer of complexity on access to those data, right? And then you have, I think, move coming from a genuine place, this idea that individual patients should have control over who can access their data. So now you have this contemplation of complicated opt-in, opt-out mechanisms where a data set that has value and has integrity could be undermined because individuals within that data set say, no, I don't want to share my data. So I would love to have a positive answer to your question, Klaus. But I think at the moment, we really collectively need to get together and say, well, wait a minute, how do we solve this problem? How do we liberate these data? Because with the advancement of AI tools, right, and the voracious nature of AI, but also the potential of AI to discover new knowledge within those data, we are hobbling it from the get-go by saying, yeah, but you can't actually have access to these data.
And that's actually a great setup to identify an opportunity.
Right.
Transforming seeming challenges into opportunity. That's what we do, and I see that as a key area for public-private partnerships that we currently have at CPATH and the ones that we can set up in the future to tackle that issue, leveraging the experience we've had. I'll go to Dionna next on being able to integrate data globally. So absolutely, but Julia, the push and the power that the living experiences have to help with that journey of the data.
It always feels like there's a huge disconnect between what people, and this is to no one's fault, but that if we had a meeting of this size right next door and it was all parents of dying children, I always thought for every conference we should have that in the room next door and just see the enormous disconnect. Like, it's when people talk about privacy, of course, like, intellectually I understand it, but I'm sitting here thinking my daughter died and I want to give as much meaning to her life and to our life as a family as possible. And it's insane to me that we're not learning. And we are, luckily, because Dr. Yu, who treated Mila, actually is a huge sharer and has helped start an N-of-1 collaborative, et cetera, to share this data and working with CPATH. But that's not true a lot of the time, right? And it's as if we're talking about what families are, their privacy without inviting them into this room, right? And breaking that wall down and asking them what's important to them. Their children are dying. They're living devastating every single day lives. And having privacy or anything else for that matter sort of get in the way of access to these incredible technologies that are out there today. That wasn't the case before, but now there are. Like, we could be treating a massive number of children, and I feel like privacy, ethics, these are legitimate things that need to be talked about, but let's try to find ways to use them to help us have more treatments and better treatments, not create yet another barrier to why millions of children should not be treated and they should just all, die. So ask the parents, because if people don't want to share their data, they won't. And we're not going to coerce anyone. But I can tell you that every single parent I've talked to, the hundreds around the world over the last, few years, would all be very, very happy to know that their children's lives were meaningful and helping the next child. And that means sharing every little bit of preclinical and clinical data as possible,
Yes, fantastic. And that's where your voice should never be an afterthought. It should be there from the very beginning in setting up every effort through collaboration that is aimed at solving unmet needs. But Dionna, you mentioned the meeting we had for our International Neonatal Consortium yesterday. And we witnessed how that consortium has transformed paradigms, not just for neonates, but paradigms that could be transformative for many other areas, especially the fact that we've been able to integrate 300,000 individual electronic health records globally from neonatal intensive care units. How do you see that as a template for many other applications for the integration of real-world data?
Yes, and I have to say, the International Neonatal Consortium has always been a pioneer in a sense. They started this organization, you all started 10 years ago, and it's really remarkable because progress is slow. And so in 10 years, you feel like, are we making progress? Are we making progress? But then when you look back and you see the foundational pieces that have been laid, particularly like a group like Inc., that have now been able to move forward a space where there has been no new innovative therapeutic progress in terms of making sure we have products available for preterm and term infants, and making sure that there are therapies that have been tested and that we feel confident in saying that they're safe and effective in this very vulnerable group. So starting from a kernel of an idea, this group has now been able to build up various work streams. And many of you are maybe familiar with the work that's been happening with Inc. and Critical Path in this space, but those work streams can absolutely be translated and applicable to other populations and disease spaces as well. So looking at, for example, all the work they've done regarding normative standards in terms of laboratory. That is so critical, but some people may feel like that's so basic, and many populations may take that for granted. But when you have a population like the neonatal population where those values aren't clear, and so therefore how can you then measure a change in those values if you don't have baselines? Just that foundational work is necessary in order to make it to the next step. And in terms of being able to integrate hundreds of thousands of patient data globally, as is being done, it just shows you that with tenacity and also having the right minds in the room through this public-private partnership, they were able to solve a problem that is a problem that now just needs to be scaled, because it was sort of a pilot to be able to show that it's doable. And now can it be scaled? And I'm not trying to make it sound like that's going to be simple per se, because as we already heard, there are policy differences, there are legislative frameworks that prevent some of this data from being integrated successfully. But this is the frontier where we are right now. So this is the next problem to solve. And so how do we make sure that we learn from lessons like Inc. and from other public-private partnerships? You all publish all the time, so we get to learn. But how do we make sure we learn these important lessons and then identify the right parties that can help us scale them even further? And of course, that means having the policymakers and the legislators actively involved in this as well.
Fantastic. And that's a perfect setup for Stefan. If you can comment on the value that the entire ecosystem gets through a process like the scientific advice mechanism that EMA has, and how we have used it to benefit the public-private partnerships and the drug development tools that we've been developing.
Yeah, I think the traditional scientific advice where a sponsor comes with their development plans, that's one thing. But I think the part of scientific advice that is relevant here is more the scientific advice related to biomarkers and identifying either new technologies, new methods, via a private-public partnership. So the methods is not owned by a single company and therefore can be stick to that, but that can be broadened out to the entire patient population, to whoever wants to use them for their research. And I think that's been some of the nice things that comes out of working with CPAS, also what comes out of working with some of the EU-funded projects and also US-funded projects in both rare diseases and others. May I look back to the discussion about privacy?
Please.
Because I completely share the concern here, and I don't think we at this very influential panel and the very influential CPAS, I don't think we can change that by tomorrow, because this is a political issue. And in my head, there seems to be a very clear distinction between patients or caretakers who have deceased relatives, their willingness to share data. And if you go into a clinical trial, you have no problem in sharing data there. And that is a little bit opposed to the general perception that if I go to my GP because I'm concerned about my blood pressure or my cholesterol, am I to share those data for the greater good? And I think there is a distinction if you're hit, but you could argue, well, if I have elevated cholesterol, I'm at risk and my data could ultimately give some pictures. But that's more difficult to explain for the general public and for our politicians. And I think that's some of the challenges we have in that privacy discussion, because of course we should protect privacy, but I don't think sometimes we make a bigger issue out of it. And you mentioned all the discussions we still are having in Europe around the European health data space for whose benefit, who can get access, who can opt in, can you opt out, and all that stuff. And one thing, as I mentioned in previously, the granularity of the data, that's one thing. But if we start out having it's more or less whether you liked it or not, you will get a data set that is completely useless, I was more to say. So we have some politicians we're going to work on. Back to your question, I think working on scientific advice, qualifying biomarkers, new methodologies, new technologies that you can enable for generating outcome of clinical trials or identifying patients for clinical trials. That's been extremely successful. And the more we can do that on a global scale, and the more we can try to integrate, because NIH, they are putting a lot of products in the sea. The European Commission are putting product in the sea. They are not coordinated at all. CPAS is trying to, step on these ice flakes that is floating around. The more we can do to bridge this, the better, coming back to the point that we need to do this globally.
And that's a major opportunity to really incorporate and empower the voice of the people that actually contribute the data. That is absolutely key. But Chris, you mentioned something about when you and I were sitting down about the start of a clinical database that from data contributed by pharma companies. There was a dialogue that I recall very distinctly about some concerns about the IP that could be lurking in the data for some discovery that could provide some competitive advantage. And now, 18 years after that, the realization that the benefit lies in being able to look at those data together and having the regulatory voice incorporated into the generation of those tools. Can you comment on how that has evolved from your standpoint?
It's such a great example, Klaus, because at the time, back in whenever it was, when we were both young and had color in our hair,
or hair,
or hair. There was an opinion within the company that's, well, hang on, why aren't we sharing these data? Because who knows, like you say, what nuggets of information reside in here which might be useful later, right? But we went ahead and we shared it, right? And, you know, the irony is that now I think what came out of the sharing is more useful to our, you know, current activities in that disease area than if we had held on to that data for our own, right? And I think there's a lesson, we learned that lesson, but I think there's a lesson for industry overall, right? Because, you know, I hope I didn't, you know, characterize all the issues around sharing data as being related to privacy. They're not. I mean, you know, the industry, you know, we are all collectively guilty, I think, of sitting on huge resources of data, which we protect because of the IP that's inherent in them, and we don't want to share them. And I think there's such a powerful role for public-private partnerships, not necessarily because you're bringing a public partner into this, but because you're getting the private partners to think about how to work collectively for a more common good, right? And I think, you know, I would love to see, I noticed that Stefan says speaker, yours says 20 years, mine says disruptive. Right?
I was just noticing that.
Yeah, what's going on here?
Can you get that one?
Well.
I think it really is time for, you know, industry with help to challenge some of the thinking around, you know, what is proprietary, what can we share and yet still derive value from this as an individual company, right, as well as a more collective good. And I think, you know, when it comes to biomarkers, because you're going to get me started again now on this one, right? You know, and I think there are people in the room that know that I've been arguing for years, can we please get away from this concept of a proprietary biomarker, proprietary drug development tool? Because, you know, and you know, a colleague of mine who I'm sure a lot of people in the room know, Elias Sahuni, was always saying, let's raise all boats, right? We can share these data, we can use these to raise all boats, everybody benefits from this. And I think, you know, I would love to see us move more towards that approach to biomarkers, to drug development tools, and hence to sharing much more of what we consider to be proprietary data somehow.
Yeah, and so the fact that our data platform has 720,000 individual records across 20 plus therapeutic areas is a testament to exactly that. But there are areas that are only beginning the journey. Another session that we had yesterday was around our alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency consortium. And they're only starting to move in that direction. And a lot of times we need to make sure that we remind everyone that other areas have done it in a really meaningful way. We were discussing how the work that is initiating in that consortium could also benefit from some dot connecting with what has happened in the type 1 diabetes consortium in talking about metrics like C-peptide. But that's a dot connection that you're going to hear about later in the conference. But the important thing is that dot connectivity. And Julia, you've clearly lived things firsthand for a rare form of Batten, but then you move it to Batten, and then you move it to lysosomal diseases, and then you move it to the mechanisms. So can you comment also on the interactions that you've had with communities that start spanning based on those connections that started with what happened to Mila?
Yeah, and I also might also just piggyback a little bit on what Chris was saying too. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, you know, individualized medicines is a really interesting paradigm to apply to what you were talking about, Chris, right? Is like, now you have, not only do you have, I don't know, maybe a dozen, you know, different companies working that need to be sharing their data. Now you're going to find yourselves with patient organizations, academics, small biotech, and eventually, I believe, larger pharma, once individualized medicines really become a mainstream way of treating disease. You're going to have all these different groups that are collecting data. One will be about Batten-Celan-7. Another one might be about Batten-Celan-3. There might be another one that is, you know, Pompe disease or other lysosomal storage, but then it gets even, you know, broader, right? And so what you want to learn is you want to at least start by learning across the many, many different groups that are doing this. Each one for 1 or 5 or 10 dying children, right? But the concept is that you need to be able to share that data across all of the ones that are receiving, ASOs of certain chemistries that are going for, their intrathecal administration for neurological conditions. Like, you want to learn across all those. So that means we are really going to be put to the test here of how can we collect that data in order to be able, like you said, Chris, is like, it's obvious that one academic that has 5 children being treated across 5 different diseases, or one company that has 10 different kits, like, they're going to learn by having access to the other eventually, right? Hundreds or more data points. The larger companies will certainly learn from, even though they're small numbers, there are many different molecules. So that is an enormous value. So everyone benefits, most importantly, the patients, right? And then those working on these individualized treatments, whether they be for Batten or a different, one of the 10,000 plus different small genetic diseases, they will all be able to benefit, by learning from ideally standardized, so the standard collection of and the standard input of data. Otherwise, like you've said, like there will be no value in this if everyone's doing it a different way. So agreeing on what that standard data set is going to be really, really critical, because now we have exponentially more players in the space, right? And CPATH, I think, is where we're going to be able to do that.
Yes, thank you. Now, Dionna, we talk about our acceleration of pediatric drug developments, but let's dig a little deeper into that, because it's one thing is the fact that the agency has been quite innovative in thinking about aspects like extrapolation of adult data into pediatrics to facilitate the quote unquote classic approach of developing stuff for adults and then making it happen in pediatrics. But this is so much bigger than just that. There are diseases that affect specifically, like you were mentioning, preterm neonates, but those diseases have consequences decades and decades later. And there are diseases that have a set of very dire consequences across human life, but Julia mentioned something really important: the timing. It may have been, sadly, too late for Mila, but we have an opportunity also through some of the innovative thinking that Bruce also at the agency, to think about how to have a setup to intervene early, but then link that to meaningful and feasible data collection years past of an efficacy and safety evaluation. Can you comment on that?
Sure, yes. Yeah, it's complex for sure. I think I will just first start with extrapolation, just because that's a space where you can clearly see the evolution over time in our thinking around extrapolation collectively as a research community, in terms of how to put a rigor around it and create a framework for what goes into how you think about what is similar and what is different. But I think one of the most recent lessons we learned through the ICH Pediatric Extrapolation Guideline and the work that went into developing that guideline is it's not an all or none situation or black and white situation or yes or no. There are things that we can leverage or learn, even if we feel like we can't fully apply those learnings in this other situation. So I say that because there are conditions like neonatal conditions or conditions in rare diseases where the pediatric or the neonatal disease itself or the phenotype is vastly different from the adult phenotype or the full adult manifestations of that disease, or the opportunity for intervention where the progress is about to accelerate is happening in childhood. And so you can, of course, then in that situation, completely take the adult experience and feel like you can be able to have a path forward for what we're going to see in neonates or pediatrics. But I do think through the extrapolation paradigm, what we found is there are sources of data that can help the understanding of natural history, of course, of biomarkers, of progression that we think about in a very sort of structured way when we do extrapolation exercises that we should be thinking about even when we're not doing extrapolation exercise. So how do we support proof of concept in these scenarios where we can't go back to our normal default of leaning towards our experience in adults? Again, this is another area where we have to think differently because we don't have that sort of parachute in this situation. So what does that mean? That means, of course, non-clinical data and understanding how that translates then into these situations. Disease models, so important to continue to invest in that so that we can have again, maybe not ideal or perfect all the time, but models that at least give us a direction so that we can understand what we're working with to be able to, again, get these candidate therapies into preclinical and then hopefully clinical application. So I think it's just sort of getting our thinking around, we still have to have that very deep, robust, critical thinking, but we have to think about it now from that evidence generation. It's going to have to come from different sources. And then those sources are then going to have to be tested and confirmed. And then every time we have some progress or we have a win, we have to apply those learnings back. And that's sort of how we have to work now in this type of paradigm.
Fantastic. Chris, how do you see the benefits of industry participating in public-private partnerships so that the dream of true mechanism-based drug development can become a reality?
That's a huge question.
You're the disruptor, so.
So let me start off, I think, by picking up on what Dionna was just saying, though, because I think, this idea of building, really robust disease models, right? And I think particularly the application of AI, we must move beyond the data. Let's say somehow or another the data is available. We can apply AI to building these models, building kind of digital virtual patients, right? Which I think would allow a lot of that extrapolation to take place very, very rapidly. And I think the role, trying to answer your question, the role of the public-private partnership, I think, is to try and bring a collective mind to bear on really accelerating this, because I think individually as companies and as academic researchers, we're all trying to move this forward. But I think collectively with the right structure, because not all PPPs are equal, as we know, right? With the right structure, then I think, we should be able to really apply a lot of collective thinking to the problem. And I think that's the solution, really, right? I think individually, we're not as clever and we're not as effective as if we work together on this. I just wanted to pick up also on some of the comments around biomarkers and drug development tools and what we're hearing about gaining regulatory approval for those, right? And I think there's definitely something we could do to be a lot more effective there if we could, and we talk about global harmonization, right? I mean, it's a goal, but you and I have had this conversation before that global harmonization is kind of like after the event, right? Wouldn't it be so much more effective if we actually got together before we've written any regulations and collectively develop those as well? And I think there's a public-private partnership model there too, right? So that you're not retroactively saying, okay, well, one regulatory authority has this, one regulatory authority has this, let's go to ICH and see if we can bring these together. You never get to that position because you started off here. And I would love to see more of that. And then a final point, because you gave me the mic, so, I'm going to take it. We also need to think about the pull-through, because once you get regulatory approval, great, okay, but does that change clinical practice? Does that change the way that patient is treated by their physician? No, because one thing you've got to have the medical establishment understand the value of these tools and the importance of doing the diagnostics, right? And discovering what is the root cause of this condition, what this patient is suffering from. But you've also got to pull that through to the payers and say, are you going to reimburse if the practitioner wants to use these diagnostics in order to work out what is the best treatment for this patient, right? I think if we don't look at the whole spectrum, then we're solving this bit, but we haven't had any material impact on the way that patients are treated in practice.
And that's actually a great expression of the way in which we are imagining that our current public-private partnerships adapt for the next 20 years, and our new public-private partnerships are set up with that mindset.
Because it's a different set of partners, if you
Yes.
think about it in that way.
Yes, yeah, exactly. We need to start expanding the pool of the collective that represents the ecosystem. Absolutely. So you're going to see that evolving in our public-private partnership. So that's a key thing that I've also discussed with Colin quite a bit, and that we're going to absolutely make happen. And we see the opportunity with these early interventions and the fact that we have areas where nothing has happened, and those to me are the biggest areas of opportunity because there's no paradigm to change. We can set the paradigm from the very beginning. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. I'll open it up for the audience to ask any questions. I think we're going to have some running mics. If anyone wants to add a comment, a question, yes, please. Two, yes.
Heard a lot today about data from industry and from the EHRs, and I know you guys have done an amazing job of getting data out of, from the EHRs. There's an enormous database. What we saw yesterday at Inc. was fantastic. What I would like to ask is how can CPATH and how can we also engage the academic community? There are enormous trials that take place in thousands of universities, and they create enormous, fabulous data sets that small companies like ours, I'm at Rialta, we would, benefit from having access to that raw data. How do we also incorporate that into your data sets? So it's a three-leg, right? It's not just industry and the Met, but it's the academia. I mean, you guys are, you're the giant shoulders we all stand on, so.
Yeah, so Chris, you remember that very early on, we also integrated a major observational data set in Alzheimer's disease that was run by academicians. And so can you comment on how we had to adapt our incentives so that they would also be in with the sharing?
You're asking me to remember those conversations. I mean, honestly, I'm going to duck because I don't actually, I think the incentives for academics, the value in the data for an academic is the publication. Right.
That's exactly it.
Right. So I think, how do we address that as an incentive and recognize that, and it's a genuine driver from an academic perspective because publication, means recognition and it means the future funding and everything about how that model works. Right. I think is about making go ahead, you finish the question.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly the setup that we have to protect and incentivize their first right to publication. So you're going to hear more about other types of observational and academic types of data that have been integrated. But let's definitely follow up on how to continue to make that happen.
Can I just say though, because the other part of it, I think NIH has mechanisms in place to encourage the sharing of data as a way to say, well, if you want future funding, then you have to show that you have a record of sharing those data.
Yeah. That's important.
Please, Janet. Can you turn on the mic, Janet? Sorry.
On? Okay.
Yes.
It's required to share it with qualified researchers after, a time period. So there is a way, if you can find a qualified researcher. My experience with that is, and Janet Woodcock, sorry, is that even these data sets, maybe it's improved over time, but academics, they might have a few discs in their drawer, and so it doesn't have the same data hygiene that you see in the industry, because it's a lower priority, I think, for the academia to keep those data in a analyzable format over time. But it can be made available, and that if it's NIH funded. Now, if it were privately funded, that's a different story. Klaus, I had a couple comments.
Yeah, please.
Okay, number one, these are 2 comments. Number one, okay, the greatest opportunity, and Dionna mentioned the new alternative methods that I worked on when I was still at the agency. Okay, who has the greatest huge database of animal studies, their results, and the human outcomes for the ones that went into the clinic? The industry does, right? We had one example of that with a kidney biomarker effort that was done a long time ago by CPATH. If you want to use alternative methods, you're going to have to set up a standard panel and look at the performance characteristics. This is driving me absolutely crazy because nobody talks about this, okay? But don't you want to know how they perform against existing methods? Don't you have probably 100,000 animal studies to compare it to and a whole lot of human output? And you have the, whatever you want to call them, the negative control, the bad outcomes didn't go in the clinic, but you have those data. So to me, it's a tremendous opportunity. And I think, honestly, all this talk about accepting alternative methods is just going to be rhetoric unless you actually do performance comparison to the standard methods. That's comment number one. Comment number two has to do with the clinical trials in individualized medicine. Okay. Now, you're not, as we heard from our colleague from EMA, we're not going to be able to do randomized clinical trials and get p-values and so forth. But another opportunity is to really understand the performance characteristics of self-controlled trials, because that's what individualized therapy is going to do. Okay, before and after, and how well do those how convincing of evidence can you get from pre and post? Rigorous, okay, you can even pre-specify what the clinically significant impact would be for that patient before doing the intervention, okay? Because ask the family, right? Like, okay, if this seizures drop by half, would that be important? If the patient can ambulate again, if the person can talk a little bit, or what have you, okay? You can pre-specify those things. So I'll stop there, but I think that's the conceptual barrier we're facing, is that people are so used to the RCT model, they cannot imagine that there's another way of gathering convincing evidence that something works, okay? Absent like penicillin for pneumococcal pneumonia like 50 years ago or something like that, right? But I do think, again, I don't know whether CPATH would be a vehicle or where, but you have to start looking at those trials as a scientific endeavor and say, how do N of 1 self-controlled trials perform? What can we learn? What are the pitfalls? It's actually a scientific effort, just like comparing if you have a non-animal study toxicology platform, what are you going to compare it against? Okay, well, you might compare it against animal toxicology studies. Like, what a novel idea. Okay, so I'll stop there, Klaus. I'm sorry.
No, you're spot on, Janet, and that's a perfect plug for don't miss the breakout session that we're going to have on NAMs. Number one. Number two, I will remind everyone that the first real NAM to be endorsed by regulators happened 10 years ago in tuberculosis through one of our consortia that was very active in tuberculosis back in those days, even before NAMS was a term in the first place. And the first qualification in history for the kidney safety biomarkers, but you pointed out something really key. It's about the predictive accuracy, and that should be the metric throughout. And then the new way of thinking about generating the evidence that regulators need to be stewards of public health and make informed regulatory decisions. That's also a component of the whole 2.5 days ahead of us. But I'll let Julia close us out.
Well, since I'm fortunate to work very closely with Janet, who's been really wonderful in helping kind of shape this new individualized medicines field that's emerging. I'll piggyback on what Janet just said. I think the build of this preclinical and clinical database for individualized medicines that CPATH is sort of beginning on and working with all the stakeholders is going to be a really enormous opportunity to change the paradigm. So touching on some of the points like academics, for example, the question earlier is like, academics were the ones that led this field of individualized medicines. It's all academics now. There is a company, I helped start a company called Everyone Medicines because I'm tired of parents having to sell lemonade and cookies and raise millions of dollars. We need to have companies. And my hope is that there'll be many more companies in this space. But right now it's primarily academics. And there's a group called the N of One Collaborative, which has 1,000 primarily academics around the world who've raised their hand and said, I would like to do what Dr. Yu did for Mila. And so there's going to be many, many, many data points. And so there'll be an opportunity, and we are having data sharing agreements and working with CPATH and N of One Collaborative, right? So it's going to start with academics, interestingly, there and move towards industry. And there's another area we can look at here, which is like, efficacy, and get rid of the term efficacy and say, what my colleagues here have said, is sort of is effectiveness, right? And how do we measure that when we have hundreds and eventually thousands of different medicines, each for small numbers of people? Like, I can tell you, ask the families, right? Like, we lived it. I can tell you that Mila, they didn't expect this after she started receiving her medicine, and her seizures went away, by the way, 30 a day, went down to nothing. She started sitting up and being able to put her hands down and sit down so she could sit across from her brother, and he could hand her a toy and she was able to sort of like hold it because she was not crumpled over. That was something that they didn't expect, and that was meaningful and measurable. So parents have a really good idea, and we have all these cool tools like these video, there's just so many different ways to have measurable outcomes that are also meaningful. And can we think about that in a different way? And can we start tracking those patients prospectively, like early on, like Janet said, and then all the way through so they become their own control? So there are so many different change of paradigms that are happening in this individualized medicine space, which is not going to be small, it's going to be big. And I think it starts with getting around the table and having these discussions early on, but not having too many meetings. I'm going to be the parent that always says this. I was actually at the FDA with some amazing people yesterday, and they were great. And we have so many good meetings and so many intellectual conversations, but at some point, we need to just change the way we do it and do it. Because what's happening is that parents are calling me every day asking if they should take their lives, how they find white coffins, how they continue living. This is what's happening by the millions. So we have to take what we learn, and we need to build a database for the sake of this discussion today. And we need it to gather academic, industry, parent, nonprofit, foundation, put it together and just go. And then we can iterate and learn and improve, but we got to stop talking about it and just do it because we know what's needed, right? And then we just need to do it. So thank you for bringing this forward.
Okay. No better way to start the day. So let's thank the panel. I'll pass it on now to my friend and colleague, Cheryl. All right. Thank you so much. Nicely done. That was great.
Thank you.